Everybody, Alex Miller at Cadmion here. Now, if you caught my video a couple weeks ago, I talked about why regulators in Ireland have a big role in enforcing GDPR. And this week, I'd like to get a little bit into more some of the insinuations I made, maybe why the hammer hasn't come down as fast as some people expected, and what are the incentives people in Ireland see? What are the reasons that this is true? So to keep me honest, I've brought in Conor Nash of NBS Consulting, at least my equal in data and vastly my superior in knowledge of Irish politics. Conor, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Alex. Great to be here.
Great. We're very happy to have you. So in my video a couple weeks ago, I talked about there's all this whispering that people in Ireland are not so excited about enforcing data privacy regulations on well-known companies like Google and Facebook that have international headquarters there. Can you tell us a little bit more? What's the reason why people suggest this? Why doesn't the Irish regulator want to do more?
Yeah, so Ireland is in a pretty unique position in the EU right now. With the loss of the United Kingdom through Brexit, it will be the only country with English as its first language, the only country with English as a strong language. It's also a member of the Euro currency union. So it's a great differentiator for Ireland, for American companies looking to enter the European market when they're looking for a place to incorporate. And so going back to Intel in the 90s and now through eBay, Google, Facebook, Zynga, a number of other very popular unicorn companies now, they've all incorporated in Ireland for their European operations. And so it's seen as a great way to make jobs for Ireland when it is a marginal country compared to the behemoths of Germany, France, and others in the EU. And they've been using that to their advantage. It's brought a lot of jobs to the Irish economy, raised the GDP per capita to fourth in the world, though obviously those statistics can be, debated and are misleading in some ways, and really have kind of contributed to a reinvention of Ireland and seeing it as not really an agrarian economy, but really a services-based economy that is on par with the United Kingdom, let's say, for what it can export to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and so I did a little bit of research. I think it's easier to find out the reasons, what Ireland's afraid of if it comes down on Facebook. Apropos of the Schrems 2 decision recently, Facebook did a sort of, well, I could take all my toys and go home, which it's a major employer there. That's not something politicians like to see. I think it's a little bit more arcane. Is Ireland ever going to start enforcing? You can see other countries, Germany, Belgium, or two that come to mind, kind of annoyed that Ireland isn't doing more. What kind of pressure is there on Ireland to change its act and start enforcing GDPR more aggressively?
Yeah, there's definitely pressure. I mean, the Data Protection Commission itself was incorporated to pursue these very kind of legal rulings. Unfortunately, it has been underfunded from the start. And there is this very strong sense in Europe that, these kind of companies that are coming into Europe should see Europe as being basically a privilege to enter, where really there's a mismatch there from the company's perspective. And there's a very strong tension, even pan-European wide, as to what it would mean to exclude a company like Google from operating in Europe. I mean, how could that even be done? Would that be in breach of WTO rules? And because of the position of the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, and because it's in such a privileged position to really make these rulings on behalf of all of Europe, it's not going to be able to make a ruling in a kind of half measure. Whatever it does, it will be a very strong ruling and it will affect many, many people. And I think while we see countries like France, Belgium, Germany make these rulings, I feel like they are still kind of feeling out what the implications of GDPR and other regulations are. And I think that the Data Protection Commission is likely to make rulings quite soon, but it also wants to take into account the fact that there is a lot of other external factors that could affect these companies and their decisions following a ruling such as Brexit, such as COVID, that they want to be able to take into account.
Yeah, as part of some research I did before this conversation, the Schrems 2 ruling, it kind of, people don't know exactly what it means. You're sort of not supposed to do this, but, they haven't stopped yet. Like, when are you in trouble? What kind of trouble are you in? So Yeah, it's a weird situation. I guess nobody really all the way knows what these regulations mean. Could you give us any kind of signposts for what might be coming? Maybe telltale signs. What does it look like if EU politicians are trying to punish Ireland? What might be a telltale sign the Irish regulator is getting ready to do more? Anything people can use to peer into a crystal ball. What's the future going to be like?
I mean, Ireland does like to keep its cards close to its chest, especially now with Brexit negotiations in the kind of top of mind. I think that it's just important to bear in mind that Ireland's position as a services-based economy is predicated on this kind of foreign direct investment. So there is tension there. Having said that, if they can't enforce the ruling, they will be overridden by a European judgment. This has happened in 2016 when Apple was found to be in breach of laws that were effectively qualifying as illegal state aid. So the European court said that Ireland was owed $12 billion in back taxes from Apple. Ireland rejected that summary judgment and went for a course of appeal. And the reason why is because they believe that the operating business that they have, the way that they've set up their corporation tax, the structure like that, is quite legal and is the way that things should be done. So it is difficult to disentangle these things, but I would imagine if you're looking into a crystal ball and you're trying to figure out what could be happening, when the pressure comes from the European Union on corporation tax rates, when the pressure comes on trade agreements, when the pressure comes on appointments of senior commissioners or members of the European Parliament or things like this, you may see that there is blowback from an overly lax approach to this type of regulation. But at the same time, the European Union is aware that there is a special relationship between Ireland and the United States and that it is likely the best location for these companies to incorporate, at least for the moment. Though, as we look into the future, more further long term, obviously the nature of technology is subject to change in a European theater.
Yeah, and so if I could just synthesize one last point, I think one thing I've learned as part of the process of making this video is GDPR enforcement is likely coming. And maybe right now we have some implicit negotiation. Prestige inside the European Union is very important in Irish politics. And we're kind of figuring out right now, we don't want to lose it not enforcing this law, but we kind of got to figure out what the cost is. Would you say that's vaguely correct?
Absolutely. I mean, Ireland had the chief trade commissioner for the EU was an appointment from an Irish politician until recently, and he had to step down due to a political scandal at home due to COVID and not obeying the compliance from the government there. It was definitely a loss in terms of having somebody at the table with an interest in Irish politics and interest in Irish economies. I would say that, there is a balancing act there. It's still not quite clear what's on the other end of that balancing act. I think that's the other end, which is what is the opposing force? What are the opposing businesses? Currently, it's been in Europe. There's been a lot of pushback from newspapers. Companies like El País, the Spanish daily newspaper, has quite vocally been critical of Google News, things like that. Those are the kinds of industries that are most vocal, and it's not necessarily clear that they are the ones that are most at risk of destabilizing some kind of European favor with Irish government or things like that. But more and more industries are becoming more interested in this, and as GDPR becomes more enforced, as more legislation is written around it by the member states, as more judicial rulings are made, and those become enshrined into law, I think it will be more difficult for the DPC to take as lax a position on these things.
So you could say this is a classic story of there's a very concentrated interest on one side and maybe a diffuse interest on the other that's just starting to get focused as an aggregate, maybe wasn't so much in the past.
I agree with that. Yeah, I'd say that there's a very clear enemy in all this, which is effectively Facebook. It's not necessarily clear who the good guys are or who is the organization that is rivaling them. I would say that if you were looking for a very sharp point of what could be an indicator of unrest or dissatisfaction with this, I would say it would be along the lines of asking to break up the Facebook operations from their American business operations so that it would be a completely European country. As we've seen President Trump initialize with these kinds of the rhetoric he's used around TikTok and the nature of breaking up that company from its Chinese parent.